This is 5 on 5, a weekly public affairs program about some of the major issues facing Massachusetts and the nation. Here for Channel 5 News and Public Affairs, Peter Mahegan.
What should we do about bilingual education? There are proposals around to change it, get rid of it, clean it up. We'll be back to talk about it in a moment. If Ron Unz gets his way, you'll be voting in 2002 whether to scrap the present system of bilingual education in Massachusetts. Unz, a wealthy Californian with a Harvard degree, has successfully led anti-bilingual ed initiatives in his home state and in Arizona. He came to Massachusetts this week after finding local people willing to support his plan to allow non-English speaking kids just 1 year of bilingual ed, followed by enrollment in regular classes.
We don't need to have little children learning every subject in Spanish, and when they graduate, what do? They don't know English, and they're living here.
Bilingual education does not work, that English immersion does work.
It's a divisive solution that is against the spirit and the legacy that has made Massachusetts a beacon in education. We need to tell Mr. Unz, thank you for coming, but no thanks.
Micha, you have some experience with this, having come to Cuba as a child. What do you think? Should we be changing this system, which is now a big bureaucracy, millions of dollars, or go the old Ellis Island sink or swim, which you did, right?
Absolutely. I am a product of immersion. I remember distinctly the first day I sat in a classroom and couldn't understand a word anybody was saying, and 2 years later I was fluent, or I think of myself as fluent. But anyway, I totally think we need to reform the system, and I think if you poll Hispanic parents, most of them understand that the facts are that these kids are failing the MCAS at 2 to 3 times the rate that other kids are. So we know there's a problem. This is a time when the state is getting ready for the standard. These kids aren't going to graduate unless they learn English. By the way, and I strongly feel they also should be able to preserve their native tongue, because for the 21st century we should be graduating kids who speak 2 languages at least. So it shouldn't be one or the other, but immersion should be part of it.
Well, it's hard to argue with what Micha said. She said it so eloquently and so fluently in English, which is proof positive that it does work. As for the preservation of the native tongue, that's fine, and it's up to families to do that, and families do it, whether it's...
or schools.
Well, but there's no reason why families can't. They can preserve ethnicity, religious background, whatever it is. The point of it is that you have a failing system, and therefore it has to be changed. There are some people I know who are second generation and still can't speak the language, speak English well. The other part of it is I noticed the defense for the program as is, the status quo, is coming from all the people who live off the program, all the people who are the bilingual educators or who are administrators or who are the people involved with the program. So of course they don't want it to change because they're getting public monies to keep it.
Well, not all of them. The state legislator Barrios, is it from Cambridge, is a leading advocate of keeping it as is. Are there not benefits from the bilingual ed program?
Of course there are some benefits, but I think that the idea of immersion will work for many students, as Micha has put forth. Look, this whole idea of bilingual started back in 1968 with Texas Senator Ralph Yarbrough doing it for Mexican children coming into Texas. Just as with special ed, when David Bartley was House Speaker in 1976 and they started that, these programs become sacred cows, and then federal dollars follow those programs so that there is a tremendous built-in resistance.
Any idea how much we're spending, or how many people work in the bilingual ed apparatus?
Well, I mean, we're spending millions and millions, but rather than just the education, there is also a cultural problem that goes on. In Lowell, for instance, the people from Southeast Asia, they want their youngsters out of that language and into English so that they can get a piece of the good life. They know that success is formulated if you speak English only. There's no. Let me just finish my point. In the city of Lawrence, it has a Hispanic population. There is more of a clinging to their language, and it is almost they see it as some sort of cultural fight to maintain the Hispanic culture and the language, and not taking English in there. Now, the Cuban population has been very different. In Florida, they have been very willing to get into English. The Hispanics from Puerto Rico, from the Dominican Republic have not been. And we should be teaching that. And people will deny it, but that's the truth.
I want to add a couple of things. One is, of course, there should be serious tutoring for those for whom immersion does not work. One size does not fit all. I think we need to reform the system, but we can't totally scrap the system. The second is, I think it's a very bad thing to reform it through referendum. I'm hoping the state legislature will convene the right group to look at this and pass legislation that avoids referendum.
What kinds of changes would be indicated in the system if if it doesn't go to referendum?
Well, I think that it doesn't have to be that one size fits all, either immersion or the traditional bilingual. I think that there are different approaches that should be taken with different children. The other thing is that this, in a political sense, this gets played out as Spanish versus English, but there are literally dozens of students from other backgrounds, Russian, Chinese, Korean, and so on. The interesting thing was a few years back when the New York Board of Ed looked at bilingual education, they found that Russian and Chinese and Korean students were what they called placing out. In other words, they were going into mainstream English classes very rapidly.
Which is exactly my point.
Why?
Which says because the Spanish population from many areas view this as their right to speak Spanish.
What's wrong with hanging on to your culture and speaking your language?
Because you can't get a job. You get something. Let me just tell you, there's no bank presidents that don't speak English. There's no one who's on the anchor desk who doesn't speak English.
But wait, the economy is, at one point, the economy is changing, and there are few people who can get hired in a lot of banks these days who don't speak two languages.
But is English one of them?
Yeah, of course. But the Hispanics have clung to it in defense of the Hispanics because of volume. They are able to do. If you're one of 3 kids in a school of 5,000 who speaks a language, of course you're going to be immersed. When you've got as many Hispanics as you do, then it's easier to cling to it.
There are about 69 languages, according to the Education Department, spoken in Massachusetts. And while you talk about bilingualism, any place where bilingualism is really in existence has caused enormous problems. Look at Montreal, the province of Quebec in Canada, with French and English. If this is going to be a country where English is spoken, then if you want your child to succeed, you really do need to get that person to speak English. And as for this one size fits all, or let's tailor make it, there are 50,000 kids in bilingual education. You can't tailor make that program. The Ellis Island experience, where millions of immigrants came over and they learned the language, is probably the best model we have that was far more successful than any bilingual education.
I agree with you, but I think we're the only country in the world that is still monocultural, and we're changing fast.
We're not monocultural. We have a whole bunch of
monolingual. Excuse me, monolingual. And I think it's very important that we recognize which most.
When I go over to England, I go to England, they seem to be speaking English too.
No, but they also speak a lot of other languages.
Micha's point that she raised in the very beginning of this segment was that this is the 21st century. In a global economy, we want our students to be speaking 2 languages at least.
One of them ought to be English.
Yes, buyers can buy anywhere in their own language. A seller has to be able to speak the language of his customers.
Right.
It may be, but the first language they ought to know is English.
No,
we're talking about how to get them to speak English quickly, and then they can learn what's going on.
Where is this fellow he was successful in California. He was successful in Arizona. If you want to define this as success, is he going to be successful here? And
well, you know something? I think if they continue the fight in the method that they have, the advocates, by labeling him as a racist just because he believes something that about 80% of the population believe, he will be successful.
In both California and Arizona, it passed with over 60% of the vote. And by the way, when you lament that this is being done by referendum, everybody always laments that. You know why we have to turn to the referendum? Because the legislature isn't doing its job.
That's right.
And this and other places,
interestingly, in California, where it has been successful and they've had a tremendous increase, 40% increase in their test scores since they went to the immersion system, there are also 188,000 waivers that are granted so that kids who just can't cut it in immersion can have something else.
This has become a way to segregate a lot of kids away from the mainstream in the schools, and they'll be much happier socially if they're part of the mainstream.
Okay, what about paid family leave? Should everyone have the same benefits that Governor Swift has? Back in a moment.